Right now, we're diving into some college basketball because March Madness is right around the corner. And you guessed it, we're talking about betting in the NCAA tournament. Craig Trapp is joining us.
Just a reminder to hit like and subscribe, and also the bell if you want to be notified every time we post a new video.
We talked about futures a couple weeks back. Maybe it was a couple weeks, maybe it was just a week. And I remember you talking about Creighton. Wow, what a pick. The value on the future for them has to be getting even better because they've had quite the run as of late. They just beat Butler by 22 today. They've got 3 big-time road wins, beating Nova, Seton Hall, and Marquette all on the road. So they're one of the teams to watch. What else are we thinking when it comes to March Madness in some of the strategies and how to bet it, and maybe some teams that people aren't thinking about?
Well, first of all, I always say the NCAA bracket process is unbelievable. We all get excited about it. Everybody fills out the brackets, and that is fun to do. But you got to put that's separate betting than betting as far as against the spread, betting money line against the spread or totals on an individual game basis. So I always say scrap the brackets when it comes time to place your bets for the opening 4 days of the tournament, because you can really go crazy if all of a sudden you start following your bracket because you pulled a couple big upsets and now you're putting some crazy money on that. So for number one, I always say scrap the brackets, put the brackets aside. Not saying don't do one. I do one. Everyone does one. Submit them. You can go undefeated and win $1 million from some of these places that you can submit them, but don't go crazy when it comes to betting your bracket.
Do you bet the NCAA tournament any differently than you do some of these day-to-day games? Is there anything different? Obviously, we've seen in the past some of these Cinderella teams coming out of nowhere to beat some of the big teams, and it's a little different than the playoffs in other sports, in that some teams, the little Cinderella schools, can come out of nowhere and beat these huge blue blood teams, not like football where Alabama's not going to get beat by Seton Hall or whoever these schools are. How do you bet differently when it comes to the NCAA tournament?
Yeah, I mean, I have 3 words I live by come NCAA tournament time: underdogs, underdogs, underdogs. Because very seldom can you make money just betting the favorites come NCAA tournament time. Now, that's always the case for us handicappers. You probably bet more underdogs than you do favorites, but in the NCAA tournament, it's even more likely. Like you say, you see the big the big schools get beat by the smaller schools. The Loyola Chicago that had an unbelievable run a few years back. You have the VCUs of past George Mason. We've seen it. It happens over and over. And even when they don't win, a lot of times they cover. So I always, every game I look at, I'm looking for the underdogs, especially when it comes to, like you said, the big conferences versus smaller conferences, because the mid-major conferences that maybe go overlooked in the regular season, now they have their chance. Usually those are the top teams from their conferences. Usually they've won the conference tournament, and they know how to win come tournament time. And I love betting those smaller conferences versus the big conferences, and that usually leads us to underdogs, underdogs, underdogs.
Right, and that's kind of twofold in the fact that you get more value when you're placing your money on teams that aren't the Blue Bloods. And get this stat, only 2 number 1 teams who are ranked number 1 at the end of the season have gone on to win it all in the last 24 years. So it gives you a grain of salt with some of these rankings and some of these schools that are ranked number 1 going into the tournament. Number 1 doesn't always win, and obviously you're not going to get good value with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's an exceptional part of course, handicapping is, what do you think the value, what do you think the number really should be if you took the front of the teams off the front of the jerseys, and that is, you have to, that's built into the bias. So the big schools, the North Carolinas, the Dukes, Michigan States, all those big names, UCLA's, they get extra points. Sometimes as a favor, most times as a favorite, sometimes even as an underdog. So you have to take that into consideration, and that's why underdogs do so much better come NCAA tournament time.
What else do you look for when you're looking for teams that might make a deep run in the tournament? We saw in baseball this season that sometimes it's not always the team that's best on paper, but the team that gets the hottest. We saw it with the Washington Nationals. In the middle of the season, they weren't even projected to make the playoffs, but then they won it all just because they got hot at the right time. Is that the case sometimes in March Madness? Is that something you look for, recent form?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we saw it, with Carmelo Anthony going all the way back to when Syracuse, they got hot at the end of the year, stayed hot, ended up winning it all. So I think teams that are run through conference tournaments, we saw it with UConn the year they won it all with Kemba Walker. teams that get through the conference tournaments. I think even Louisville, one of those years that they won the national championship, won their conference tournament. So I love teams that come off of conference tournament wins. The one worry can be a little bit worrisome as you play so many games in a short amount of time. So you might have to play 3 games the week before, have 4 days rest, and then you have to play 2 games in a 3-day period, the opening week of the tournament. So always be careful with those teams, but those teams always seem to do well for me. Unfortunately, those usually end up being favorites. So as far as against the spread betting, you have to be a little careful there because sometimes, because they have such good recent form, that the lines are way inflated.
We've talked about this before in the fact that you like teams with good guard play. Are there any other patterns or things that you see in common with teams that you really like heading into the tournament?
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's 2 things. With good guard play, you get usually experience. Usually those come off of very experienced teams. And then I love experienced coaches. We've seen it over and over. Rick Pitino was unbelievable in the tournament. Of course, Tom Izzo has been really good in the tournament as a top seed, and even as a lower seed, we've seen him show up and get all the way to the Final Four. So when I talk about betting, and that's against the spread betting that we're talking, I love experienced guard play, experienced teams, and experienced coaches that have proven track records come the NCAA tournament time, especially if they're underdog. I really then that gets me a second look. So I'm looking at an underdog that has experienced guard play, and usually what I would consider a coaching edge. If you just say the teams are even, which coach would you take? If those are underdogs, those are usually some of my top plays, especially the first opening 4 days of the NCAA tournament.
How much value do you place on there's not a home team in these games. They do have regions where it's a little bit of a closer drive for some of these teams, but it is a neutral site. How does that impact the way you bet some of these games?
Well, it's funny because you can be a little crazy because sometimes just because, say, Duke is playing in North Carolina somewhere, but guess what? A lot of people don't like Duke that are not from Duke. The Duke fans are still going to root for their teams, but the other teams actually start rooting for the underdog. So you can get maybe a little too carried away, especially the opening 2 days when you're going to have a much more divided crowd than you will, say, Sweet 16 and the Final Four.
How much stock do you put in teams that play well on the road? As I mentioned earlier, Creighton has 3 really solid road wins, Villanova, Seton Hall, and Marquette, and they just beat Butler. I don't know if that was on the road or not, but still a good road team. How much stock do you put in that?
It doesn't really concern me, especially because I just think being good on the road and being good at neutral sites sometimes can be 2 totally different things. I would much rather see teams that did well in the early season in these neutral site tournaments that we see, either in Maui or the Atlantis down in the Bahamas. I like that. Also, they were good, like we said, in conference tournaments, and that leads you to the hot teams. I love those type of teams, but to me, I would those teams usually get way overplayed. So sometimes you have to look at the value on that one.